Welcome one and all to this online book launch of a very interesting book, The Flip Side of Free. It's written by our very own Michael Kende. Michael Kende is a visiting professor at the Graduate Institute of Geneva with a distinguished and very long career in Internet matters. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Trade and Economic Integration that I run with Jos Powellen. He's a senior advisor at Annalise Mason, former chief economist of the Internet Society. He has a PhD from MIT in economics and a BA in mathematics and economics from Bowdoin. For 5 years, he was a professor at INSEAD Business School. And before that, he was director of Internet Policy Analysis at the US FCC, Federal Communications Commission, responsible for managing a wide range of policy issues and regulatory decisions. And now he is a book author. And I tell you, what a book it is. Let me just read you one of the quotes from the back before I let Michael take over and tell you what's actually in it. So this quote is, believe it or not, from Vint Cerf, who is like, Albert Einstein of the internet or something like that. He said, "I read this book in one sitting. So should you. Clear, balanced, nuanced, and analytic. I have lived the internet story, and this book puts its choices in a clear light." And I've read it too. It's really a very compelling read. Easy to read, and you're going to be really happy you did, because there's lots of things that you've been wondering about that Michael puts into a perspective that you will understand afterwards. And it's very clear that Michael spent much of his career writing for real people who do not have time to wade through a book which is filled with unnecessary jargon. He cuts to the point and puts it in plain language. So with that, I will turn it straight over to Michael, who will present the book. As the way these things work, you've got like 25 minutes to go through several hundred pages, but let's see how Michael does it. Thank you very much. Turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Michael, and Tamara and the Center for hosting this virtual book launch. I will just show a few slides. So this book is about 4 or 5 years in the making. I put together a course at the Graduate Institute called the Internet Economics and Governance. And as I was putting it together, I couldn't quite find the book that suited my needs. I guess a lot of authors say that, and started thinking about a book. And at the beginning, it was just going to be about free. But then kind of the techlash really started kicking in, and I started talking more and more about the flip side. And so I added that to the title. And now it's balanced between why is the internet free, what are the economics of free, and what are the downsides of that. And I'd just say that overall, I remain very optimistic about the internet. I hope that comes through in the book. I mean, just think how we would have gotten through this pandemic without the internet, without the ability to do this. But we have to be realistic. There's some problems with it. So I try and offer some solutions throughout the book and at the ending as to how to keep all the benefits of the internet and remove some of the downsides. So first, a few numbers. We've all seen some of these incredible numbers, but here we have one network, or a network of networks with 4.6 billion people on it. Some of the services, many free, like Facebook, has 2.8 billion monthly active users. A lot of users put in their own efforts. 6.2 million articles in English on Wikipedia, with 1 billion edits, all done for free to keep the internet, to keep the Wikipedia growing and better. Barack Obama can reach 129 million Twitter followers with one tweet. Incredible amount of content is uploaded every minute to YouTube, and even more is viewed every minute. And just amounts of traffic that are really hard to comprehend, 112,000 gigabits per second. So a lot of this is built on free. And now I'd just like to turn to start looking at the upside of free. That is the economics of why things are free on the internet. And that includes free standards, free services like WhatsApp, and even a lot of times free access, like free Wi-Fi. So we'll go through each of those in some detail now. So I think we're all familiar with this idea that free services on the internet are not really free. We're exchanging our data to get the free services, and they're paid for with advertising. But actually, the first really successful monetization, if you like, of free services came after the dot-com bubble, and that was Google. And actually, they really didn't need any data for this. It was a very simple, and in hindsight, kind of obvious model, but at the time, people weren't sure it would work. But the idea was when you put in your search, like used cars Bristol, you're basically saying what you're interested in. And advertisers can bid to put in their ads. They bid on the keywords used cars, and they bid, and if they're selected, their ads appear either in either of those red boxes. It's been changing quite a bit. And if you click on one of those, the advertiser pays Google. So very simple model, didn't need a lot of data. But because they were only paid by click, it started to make sense to gather more data. So for instance, if the user didn't say Bristol, then you would still like to know where they are because the advertiser wants to be local. So you bring in the location if you can so that you show the right ads. And then you might want to start showing different ads to different people based on what their preferences might be. Some people might like BMWs, some people might like VWs. So you start to gather more information, more data about the people so that you can show them the ads that they're most likely to click on. And then of course, they open the accounts, which are unique to a person, and it's easier and more efficient to gather data that way, and mobile phones gather more data. So of course, more and more data was being gathered as a way of helping to target these ads. But again, in the beginning, it was purely based on what you typed in to that box. They would show you the ads based on those interests. So the next thing that's typically free on the internet is access, usage, the data, in the following sense. So if you walk into Starbucks, you can sit down and open your computer, go onto the Wi-Fi, and make a video call to 10 people all around the world for an hour while you're drinking your coffee. Now you might say, well, obviously Starbucks wants to bring people in, so of course they're going to offer that for free. But if you went to the Starbucks, to the counter, and asked the barista if you could use their fixed phone, if they still have one, to make a call to China, for instance, for an hour, they would say no, even though you're actually using the exact same infrastructure. You're using the same lines, and it's going along the same way all the way. The difference is that Starbucks, when you're making these video calls and surfing, they don't pay anything more for that. Whereas when you make the phone call, they do pay. And the reason can be seen on the right-hand side with the, if you use the cars and the lanes as an example. So with telephony, every phone call creates what's called a circuit, from the beginning from the caller to the receiver, and it reserves that circuit. So it's like reserving a lane just for one car. And you pay for that lane, you're reserving that lane for your exclusive use, whether you're talking or not, whether there's dead time or not. And so of course you need a lot of lanes if everyone's going to have their own lanes, and you can't have an infinite number of lanes, so you charge for them so that they're used efficiently. Whereas on the internet, to get over this inefficiency, they invented something called packet switching. And with packet switching, everything that you do on the internet, and this is not a technical book, but just bear with me, everything you do on the internet gets broken down into little packets. And like the cars on the freeway, they just all merge together, go along, and then get off at their exit, and they're reassembled into whatever you sent. So it's very efficient use, because there's technically no dead space like there is on a phone call. And all you're really paying for is maybe a monthly fee for a certain number of lanes. That is a certain amount of bandwidth. And then you can put as much or as little on those on the bandwidth as possible. And if there's a lot of people, like on the right-hand side of the freeway there, it might go a little slower. If there's nobody at 3 in the morning, for instance, like on the left-hand side, then your traffic will go faster. So you're really just paying for the number of lanes, and eventually you might want some more bandwidth and you pay a higher monthly fee. But once you've paid it, all the usage is not charged. So that really promotes usage. You don't have to think about how much every video call is going to cost you, how much every movie you're streaming is going to cost you, other than maybe the cost of the movie. So that really helps to promote usage. And finally, the final piece of free is free standards. Since the beginning of the internet, since the time of Vint Cerf, who kindly gave that nice quote, the standards have been developed, and he, by the way, developed the TCP/IP that's on the right-hand side there. But the standards that have been developed collaboratively by groups. They develop things that they want to use. The guy who invented email and put the @ between your name and your computer just thought it would be a nice thing. No one told him to do it. There was no commercial incentive. He just thought people might like to use email. And obviously, he was very, very right. And so all these standards just kind of grew out of the needs of the initial developers. And then others helped to develop them. Companies got involved and helped to develop and offer their own intellectual property. And the key is they're all free for anyone to adopt and to create a website or to create a new service. And so this really fuels a lot of innovation, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you have access to this universal global standard that's all over the world. And there's really probably not another standard that's so universal that you can buy any computer, it'll work with any Wi-Fi, with any internet service provider, most browsers, and everything's kind of interchangeable no matter where you go, no matter what you're doing. So that's really the benefit of these standards. And finally, they're all free, and free is a special price. And it is an economics book, so I talk a little about behavioral economics, which is this, not new anymore, but it's a form of economics of understanding how people behave in the real world. And they like to do experiments, and they usually do them on campus because students don't have a lot of money, so it doesn't cost a lot of money to run the experiment. And this experiment they actually did at MIT. And they had a little stand. They didn't say it was an experiment, and they offered 2 types of chocolate, the Lindt truffle on the left and the Hershey's Kiss on the right. And if you don't know what the Hershey Kiss is, it's chocolate-like, it's almost chocolate. And so when they offered it at these 2 prices, 15 cents for the Lindt, 1 cent for the Hershey Kiss, the students overwhelmingly chose the Swiss chocolate. 73%. And then they dropped the price by 1 cent for each of them. So there was the same difference between the prices. So given there was the same difference, the rational argument would be that there would be roughly the same amount. People would still be willing to pay 14 cents more for the Lindt chocolate. However, you may have guessed, it completely flipped, where suddenly much more people wanted the free Hershey Kiss. So this is an example of behavioral economics that people don't always act rationally, but they tend to do it in a fairly predictable way. And this really helps to explain the true benefits of free with the internet, particularly the free services, because the same thing would happen in reverse. If you suddenly woke up one day and were typing in a Google search and it said, which is normally free, obviously, and it said, please put in a credit card, and even if it was charging a fraction of a cent per search, people would be quite upset and they would look for alternatives, not necessarily because of the price, but psychologically they've changed it from something that was free and in this nice free category into something paid. So that's really truly the benefit of free. So that was the first section of the book, really the upside of free. And then I start to look at the downsides, the flip side, and look at three major ones: privacy, cybersecurity, and platform power, market power of the internet companies, big tech. And really, I argue that the link between these two is data. That all of the things on the left side, all the free services and usage drive use of the internet, which helps to generate more and more data, much of it in the hands of the private companies. And that in turn is kind of the heart of privacy, is our personal data, the target of hackers, and the purpose of cybersecurity is to protect our data. And data really helps to fuel the growth and market power of some of the bigger companies, because they have a lot of data that they can use to monetize. I also talk briefly about kind of an opposite problem, that there's a chapter on the digital divide and what can be done to bring more people online and to close the digital divide. And I argue that even when the digital divide starts to close, there may be left a data divide, that companies just haven't been generating enough data in these countries to develop new services, whether it's voice assistants or self-driving cars, and that there's going to be this data divide, and it's going to be harder to monetize and develop new services in the developing world. Now, hopefully, as those services do develop, they'll learn from some of these downsides and the efforts taken to alleviate the downsides as they're existing now in Europe and the US and other regions, but that there still might be this data divide. So as an example of some of the privacy issues that we're facing, as you know, there was the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th by supporters of the former president. And someone an anonymous at an unknown company was so upset about it that they leaked a lot of smartphone data to the New York Times. This data showed what was happening in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. So on the left-hand side, you can see the White House and the stage where the former president was speaking. And then if they did this nice little picture, you can see all the green dots are the people. After the speech, they all migrate to the US Capitol, as they were told to do in an attempt to stop what they viewed as the steal of the election. And this data could be used and was used by the New York Times to show who was in the Capitol. You can see some of these green dots are in the Capitol. They also could use it to track some of the people who were at the Capitol from their houses or to their houses after the rally. And because every smartphone assigns a user a unique ID, the New York Times actually combined data sets and was able to identify individual people that had been inside or near the US Capitol on that day. And it's very likely that some subpoenas are taking place to get this information legally from the companies. But whatever you think about the motives of the leaker of this data, it really highlights the type of data that's available and that we're giving off. And while you may approve of this use of the data, they can do the same thing around an abortion clinic or other areas to identify people who have been protesting governments or having medical procedures. And this leads to an idea that is a bit confounding of something called the privacy paradox, that even if the people that were storming the Capitol knew about this location data that they were just, all of us are throwing off, would they have done anything about it? Would they have turned it off? and most people wouldn't. Most people, a lot of people who worry about privacy don't necessarily let it impact their behavior. And that's really for two reasons. One is we get benefits out of these online services, there's no question. One study showed Facebook had a value of $1,000 per year per user. So we have some benefits from these. And also we might not fully understand the risks. We don't have all the information. And even if we did, because of this behavioral economics, we wouldn't necessarily make rational decisions. So we might know that our location is being tracked, but we don't turn it off because of the benefits. And even if we do, behavioral economics shows that we prefer immediate benefits to longer term possible harms. And that's not just with our data, that's with smoking, bungee jumping, wearing a mask. People understand the risks sometimes and they're willing to take them for the benefits. Data is a little harder because it's not so clear all the time that there's going to be a downside. It's not like if you click on the wrong link, within 20 minutes, your bank account will be empty. Usually these things take time, people combine data when they attack, and so the downside is not always clear. So any attempts to address privacy really have to deal with this privacy paradox and help people make or help people make better decisions in a sense. Now turning to cybersecurity, if you haven't heard of it, and I assure you I'm not a customer, Ashley Madison is a website, well, for lack of a better word, it's a dating site for married people to facilitate cheating. And of course, as shown by the woman there, discretion is one of the key points of this, right? Everyone, by definition, is married and is cheating, so they want discretion. And in fact, Ashley Madison offered this full delete service where you could pay $19 to be permanently deleted from the database if you decided you didn't want to participate anymore. Well, sure enough, there was a data breach. In 2015, all 37 million users were breached and put online, and it included all the people who had paid $19 to be fully deleted but hadn't been. This, of course, led to some huge problems, as you can imagine. Divorces, there was blackmailing of people who were on the list, there were suicides. So, the Ashley Madison was sued, and in the end, after 2 years, the lawsuit was settled for just $11 million, including legal fees, which were about a third. And for instance, if you had paid $19 to have your name removed, you simply were refunded the $19. So not much of a settlement. Now you think, okay, financially they weren't destroyed, but reputationally they must have been. But in fact, last year, at the end of last year, they had almost twice as many users as they had before. So rather than saying this is way too risky, a lot of people seem to have said, hey, I didn't know there was a dating website for this, sign me up. And they actually doubled their numbers. And so this really illustrates some of the market failures with cybersecurity. We don't really know what's going on in the website. We don't know how good the security is. So that's one of the problems. And even if something bad happens, the cost isn't very high for the company. Here, just $11 million for 37 million names. So there's really not that much incentive for companies to invest in good security if they don't want to. And it was clear that Ashley Madison was not just fraudulent for not deleting the names, but negligent in how easy it was to get access to the database. So what to do about it? We can look at other industries to see how they've solved these issues. So for instance, in the car industry, this is a real exhibit where they've taken a 1965 Ford Mustang and put it together with a 2015 Ford Mustang. And in many ways, the cars are similar. They take 4 people at the speed limit. Obviously, the one on the left is more comfortable, but the real significant, in fact, life-changing difference between these cars is security. safety. The one on the left had just lap belts in the front, no headrest, no seat belts in the back, nothing else. The one on the left has full shoulder straps, airbags to protect you in the crash, and a lot of features to help you prevent a crash, the braking systems, the detection, the lane detection. So the one on the left is much, much safer. And the reason is, actually in 1965, Ralph Nader wrote a book about how unsecure cars were and how companies didn't want to spend money. And it triggered a complete rework of safety on cars, where now they have standards of what a car of safety. They test the cars. If the companies don't live up to the testing, there can be liability, there's ratings, and there's a lot of competition in car safety. And all of this has to take place within the internet too, that there has to be more standards, there has to be more testing, and some more liabilities. So particularly if a company like Ashley Madison is negligent in their cybersecurity, there's a bigger penalty for it, so that they're more willing to invest in security. Finally, the book looks at market power. It really points out how in the beginning, especially during the dot-com boom of the late 90s, everyone thought the internet could be even more competitive than the physical world. You just put up a website, even Amazon, which did sell physical products, just started in a garage. It didn't have to have a bookstore, do any investments in inventory. He just bought the books when someone ordered them and shipped them out, and obviously grew from there into the full Amazon. But the entry costs were very low. You could really reach the whole world, particularly if you were sending files, books, online books, movies, audio could be sent globally. So there was a lot of global competition and choice for customers. And in the beginning, the idea was that it was very easy to switch services. The Google CEO at one point said competition is one click away, and that just like people just decided to try Google, if they decided something was better, they would move. So the original idea was that these markets should be very, very competitive, but it didn't work out that way. And this chart shows that now the internet and IT companies are among the biggest. This is the US market cap, but they're among the biggest in the world. So what happened? First of all, of course, if you're very innovative, and I would argue that these companies are, and particularly if you offer lower free prices, you're going to get a high market share, which is one sign of market power. And if you're providing a platform, you have an additional advantage that you don't have to buy your own taxis, your own real estate, create content. You just are a platform mediating between the buyer and the seller, or the developer and the consumer. So that would argue that you can build up naturally market share in this market. But traditionally, market power was based on having high entry barriers, which in a traditional sectors, you would be able to keep a high market share and raise your prices, and no one could compete with you. And what's happened on the internet is that there's some entry barriers, not necessarily leading to high prices, but making it hard to enter. There's network effects. If you're with Facebook, you want to be able to communicate with your social circle, with your colleagues, with your family. So you're less likely to want to move. So that's also a switching cost. There's the winner takes all idea that in the physical world, it takes a lot of effort and investment to expand. So if you look at some of the troubles Tesla had when they rolled out new models, they had to build new factories, test them. And it took a couple of years to really build up scale. Whereas with the internet, if your website or your app is successful, if you're using cloud computing, you can meet all demand overnight, and the winner takes everything. There may not be room for any second place. There's switching costs, as I said, and it turns out that there are actually economies of scale. Amazon, of course, invests hugely in distribution centers. All of the companies are investing in data centers and in other parts. So it's hard to get up to the scale of these companies. But going back to the idea of free, it's particularly hard to assess market power if services are free, because one of the ways of assessing it is if you're able to raise price. So there's been some trouble in assessing market power, and that's slowly starting to change in Europe and now with the new administration in the US. And one of the things that maybe the market power is not necessarily the ability to raise price, but the ability to use your position to gather and more data. And data in the internet can help you to be persistent and to enter new markets. So Netflix gathers data on preferences, and they can use it to make recommendations. But when they started to make their own content, they could also use it. And in fact, House of Cards was their first original series. And they bought 2 seasons of it for $100 million based on assessing their all of their users' preferences and calculating very correctly that their users would love House of Cards. So that they can leverage what they have in terms of all of these preferences and likes and dislikes of their users into creating content in ways that non-digital studios have trouble doing. Now, moving towards the future is going to be built on data, big data being stored, processed, and analyzed. The Internet of Things, a lot of them are going to be sensors that are gathering more data. Machine learning is going to use data to teach, to drive the development of artificial intelligence. So data is going to be a key part of it. And it's also going to have to be built on trust, that people are going to have to trust these new services in order to start to use them. And there's some signs that that trust may not be there as we're getting these new self-driving cars maybe, or these voice assistants that can potentially, people think, listen in on what they're doing in their homes. So the way to address this is through data governance as a way of building trust, because as more and more of our economic activities move online, we're going to need data governance, because the difference between offline and online is data. The difference between a traditional bookstore and Amazon is Amazon has a lot of data that it can use to run its operations, to develop new their Amazon Basics line of items. They use the data to see what people like, and then they create things to sell to them, competing with their suppliers. So data is really going to be the key, and there needs to be data protection laws and more transparency to develop privacy. And cybersecurity, the liability has to be increased so that there's more harm of having bad security like Ashley Madison, and maybe gathering less data and encrypting it, so even if it's hacked, it can't be used. And for market power, instead of maybe fining companies or trying to break them up, data sharing may be an option, so that if they've gathered data, let's say on rides in a city, if you're Uber, they have to share the raw data with competitors to allow entry, or allow their services to be interoperable so it's possible to compete with a messaging service or a video service like this. So I will stop there for questions. And again, thanks very much for coming online and participating in this virtual launch.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that fascinating presentation. What I'm going to do first is abuse my position as moderator to ask you a few of my burning questions about the internet. And if you don't want to answer them, I'll give you 2 at a time so you can answer the ones you like. So here's the first one: is this whole thing about market power. Google doesn't have market power in the search market. They have market power in the advertising market. So why can't we just see that these guys, Facebook and they're monopolists in the advertising market and therefore should be broken up. That's the first one. The second one, you probably read this book, Radical Markets, by Posner and Weil. And their idea is that, this exchange of free services for data, that's a barter thing. But then the companies treat the data like capital, like it's theirs. They can put it in their library and keep it forever. And what these guys said is, well, they should only be able to keep it for a month. And then they'd have to pay us or convince us to give it again every month. And so that would be one way of getting over it. And I'll throw in my last one, and you'll see what that is. Why didn't the internet end up more like Wikipedia? Or what happened with Wikipedia that it didn't get turned into a $1 trillion company? So take your pick among those, but there's lots of questions, so I'll also pass it over very soon. But don't answer them all.
All right, thank you. I mean, I think Wikipedia, some of it comes down to, the preferences of the founder. In that case, Jimmy Wales was happy bringing this service online. It's the same here in Geneva. Tim Berners-Lee developed the World Wide Web. He's a millionaire, but not a billionaire, because he did it at CERN, and he made them turn everything over to the public so that they could, develop browsers, develop websites, and have it as a free public good. So some of it really just comes down to the preferences of the developer, the innovator. On the search side, I would argue that some of it is the US really just looks at consumer harm. And if the prices go up, there's a consumer harm. And if they don't, they view it as no harm. I think they view the search and advertising market as organically grown at this point, that they grew into that because they have a good service and it's low priced. But I think that's going to start to change, particularly a lot of the investigation is now how they're leveraging their, market power in one market, if you like, into other markets. And that's where they're going to start investigating. That is, you can have market power, but you can't monopolize other markets using that. So I'll answer 2 out of the 3.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have Richard Hill online, and he's going to ask you a question. Michael, can you unmute Richard? And Richard, please go ahead.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Wave if you hear me.
Yes.
Great. Hi, Michael. So I want to be clear. I've read this book, and I think it's positively brilliant. And I think actually it's a must reading for anybody who wants to say anything sensible about internet going forward. And I'm going to write a review on that, and it's going to start that way. What I wanted to do here, other than say that the book is absolutely brilliant, is say that there are a couple of things which came out in Michael's presentation, which I think it's looking at the world from the internet point of view. I've been around a bit longer than the internet, so I look at it in a bit more complex way. For example, packet switching is not actually new. Telegraphy, believe it or not, was packet switching. It's not the same, obviously, but it's different. Circuit switching actually can be more efficient than packet switching if you need quality of service. And they've tried to retrofit it a little bit through MPLS and the internet. And actually, all standards are free to use unless they have patent policy, but actually the IETF ones also have RAND patent policies, not W3C. So that isn't really a differentiator. What was different from the ITU is that they were free to read, which wasn't the case before, but is still the case now. But these are kind of nits. So basically, my evaluation is that the book is absolutely a must read, and okay, it's got some things about the internet that I don't particularly agree with, but that's irrelevant. It's still, the basic message is absolutely spot on. And again, this has to be read, and it's got just one thing, because I just can't resist this. It's got one idea which I think is new, because I never heard it before, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's on page 143. And Michael says it's possible that a new metric is needed to measure market power, especially when services are offered for free. And Richard, that goes to your question. When normally a profitable increase in price was a strong metric, the new metric may be the ability to profitably gather data and monetize it through advertising without losing market share. And Michael goes on to discuss what the implications of that are and what we should do about it. And I think that's really the key. And I had not seen that idea before. So many thanks, Michael, for all this work.
Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you. And thanks you did review a few of the chapters for me. Thanks. And you're not responsible for any of these issues that you raised. I mean, I do mention packet switching was available before. It was actually developed by someone who visited MIT and saw how inefficient it was at the time for computers to use telephone circuits. But thanks for those views, and I'm looking forward to your review.
Great, thank you, Richard. So the chat is filled with people who apparently want to be co-authors and are making points that they wish you had made or not. There's not that many questions, but let me pull out some of the questions. So one, this is a little bit going along the lines of Wikipedia. Why didn't Encyclopedia Britannica become the Wikipedia? You know, they had such an enormous database, an enormous thing, but they didn't win. That's the question. How would you view that from your perspective of the economics of the internet?
I think that, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. I think that in a lot of areas, the incumbents take time to recognize new ways of doing things, and are reluctant to do them. And I think there's a trust issue. And my understanding is Britannica thought that their experts were better than a bunch of people working for free. And by the time they realized and people started doing peer reviews showing that, in fact, there were about the same number of mistakes, it was almost too late. And of course, Wikipedia is free, Britannica is very expensive. Wikipedia automatically updates, Britannica doesn't. I guess they could have gone online, but they just had a paid model, and it took too long for them to see the change. And I think that there's a general idea that a lot of people didn't see what was coming because they thought that they built up a trust model. If you think about taxi companies, hotels, all of these, who would have thought that you'd get into someone else's car and get a ride, or fall asleep in someone else, a stranger's house, with the Airbnb model? And by the time, if there was anything they could have done about it, by the time they realized it was in some ways too late.
Thank you. Yeah, the praise for your book keeps rolling in on the chat. But so let me and there's a few that are a little specific. So what would you say about the needs for ubiquitous access as telco perspectives, and the need for users to get connected? Does that it doesn't make any sense to me, but I was hoping that you would know what ubiquitous access was about. Does that trigger a particular thing?
The needs of ubiquitous access, I mean, I suppose it's really just having access everywhere. If I understand it, I mean, in most developed countries have relatively close to 100% coverage of some type of mobile broadband. Developing countries, and there is a chapter which we didn't get to, that talks about those, and obviously there's a lot of work to be done there. But I think that answers it. Otherwise, Thomas, put something else in, please.
Here's a very specific one, which I like very much, is how would you tease out the tension in your suggestion from the final slide of alleviating market power by encouraging data sharing while simultaneously protecting privacy through data protection? How can trust be increased if data is to ostensibly be more widely available? Sebastian asked that question.
That's an excellent question. And all of those three things kind of have to be done simultaneously. That, you know, improving privacy will reduce cybersecurity issues and possibly reduce market power. But I think that's a good point. You couldn't do any data sharing if there wasn't a way of really protecting the data. Now, one way that can be done that's kind of interesting, and actually it's Tim Berners-Lee has started this new service called Solid, is that we put our own kind of data agent, or kind of a disk drive to save our data in front of the companies. So every time I take a ride on Uber, for instance, it saves the ride on my phone and also gives it to Uber because I've chosen to use Uber. But I could share that with a taxi company. I can share that with the city so they can see where people are going. So there's this idea of you know, giving us more agency with a protected app that saves our data, and we can decide who we share it with and under what conditions. So that's an interesting one, but it may not create the big data that some of the companies that some of the companies enjoy, but it may make it easier for us to switch to new companies and share our data with new companies.
So we have 15 minutes left. Let me take one more of these quite specific questions. This is from Alexander Maza. What potential and challenges do you see with the use of digital identity to generate revenue for internet users, individuals, or organizations through cryptography-based solutions like decentralized identifiers, blockchain, etc.?
Okay, I'm not quite sure on the technology side, but there is this idea that we should own our data and sell it, which I do cover in the book. But I would argue that that if companies are buying our data, they may treat it even worse than under the current conditions because they'll feel ownership over it. So that it's not necessarily going to improve privacy if we're selling our data. Also, our individual data may not be worth that much. People have done these experiments where you can sell your data and you just get pennies because what you need is big data. You need data on a lot of people to be able to really analyze, right? Just taking the Netflix example that I used, knowing my movie preferences doesn't do a streaming service any good. They need to know everybody's movie preferences. So they're not going to pay me much for mine because they need to buy everybody's.
Right, right. Now let me ask you a little bit about governance since we're in Geneva here. What would you if somebody made you king of the world and you could decide the priorities of which governance bits we need to fill in first, what would that be for global governance of internet stuff?
I would argue that it's the digital trust, which I would put together privacy and cybersecurity, that really needs to be addressed. Because, and I talk about in the book, and I think we saw last weekend here in Switzerland, there's kind of this idea related to the privacy paradox, which you might argue is a trust paradox, that even though we see all these trust issues, Ashley Madison, all these data breaches, what happened on January 6th, we're very unlikely to give up services that we're comfortable with, that we use, that are necessary for us. But we're seemingly more reluctant to try new ones that we know we can live without. So in Switzerland, they had a vote on a digital ID over the weekend, and 64% of people voted it down. They've developed the Swiss COVID app, which could help us track transmission using our smartphones and get us out of this nightmare. Only 22% of Swiss are using it. So I would argue that we need to solve these problems and create a real foundation of trust, not just for using existing services, but to give us enough trust to try these new ones where we would get a lot of benefits.
Great. So one thing you didn't touch on very much, but is of deep concern of people in Geneva, but also all over the world, is the digital divide. And in your book, you very explicitly say this, or at least the first part of the book, this is mostly rich country problems, but the poor countries also have a lot of problems. What would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the problems there are, a lot of it is access, of course, that people just aren't going online. And the interesting thing that's happened in the past 10 years, I would say, is that it used to be that it was focused on availability when everyone was going online with fixed broadband. There just weren't enough phone lines in most developing countries. So the real worry was, how are we going to get the phone lines? How are we going to deploy these networks? Now there's been this complete flip with mobile networks, which in some countries like Rwanda cover 100% of the population can have 3 or even 4G in Rwanda, but about 20–25% are taking it. So it's really forced this change in not just looking at availability, but looking on the demand side. Why aren't people going online? Is it affordability? Is it the relevance of the data? The things that we like, the things that are plentiful for us on the internet aren't necessarily of any interest to anyone in Rwanda. And it's sometimes the digital skills, just being comfortable going online and working online. So all of these things need to be addressed. I hope that countries are learning from kind of the mistakes and the problems that I've raised here in the developed world, so that they put in place good data protection laws and good privacy protection, so that they don't repeat the problems and they can build up digital trust as people go online.
I have a very specific question here about the European data. Let me see, I was here for a second. Oh yes, the European Database Directive. Do you think that this could be of use going forward? I guess that's a very, very specific question. So
Database directive.
Okay, so that
I mean, if it's anything like the GDPR, you know, Europe has been really leading in a lot of these areas, the EU, and so if it's anything like that, then I think that other people are looking at what Europe is doing.
Mm. Well, just to sort of meander down that path a bit more, I guess you've heard, you didn't use the word splinternet that I found in your book anyways, the idea that there's different internets. So I guess it's quite clearly there's one in China and there's one outside of China, and maybe other countries are creating them, and maybe the GDPR and stuff like that will create more. What is your view of that? Are we going to a world where it really is no longer integrated?
I mean, in parts, yes. There's clearly that with the Great Firewall of China, that it's, and there's a lot of entry restrictions on companies going into, you know, going into China, so that allowed the kind of the Chinese doppelgangers of Google and Facebook and others to develop and really, you know, grow an amazing market with, you know, far more digital payments and things that are here. Now, it used to be that it was a one-way thing, that the Chinese companies could easily sell and extend their services outside of China, not the other way around. Under the Trump administration, they started to cut down on, you know, Huawei and some services like TikTok, and it's so that it came a little more, I guess, from that viewpoint, proportional, but it's not clear what the Biden administration will do on that front. But that was certainly helping lead towards a more fractured internet. The one thing that hasn't happened yet, I should say, is on the standard side. Everyone has used the same standards, so that Wi-Fi, all the underlying standards are similar so far.
So I have a question here. Microsoft, Google, and Facebook are today's major open source software providers, with consequences to lower software prices and providing trust to review these softwares and how they control our data. What is your thought about the place of open source in this internet economy?
Yeah, open source is fantastic. A lot of the services that we're relying on that we don't even know are open source, in terms of encryption, web, you know, router software. If you're using Firefox, that's open source, that was released by Netscape. So yeah, there's a lot of benefits of this. It's kind of a similar model to Wikipedia, that people you know, contribute and help to develop new software and new features. I do talk that there is a potential downside of free riding, that we may not know that far too little is invested in security, and there was potentially a very major security flaw from some open source software a few years ago, and now all the companies have actually chipped in to provide resources to make sure that doesn't happen again. But in theory, open source, everyone can review, and a lot of people and a lot of tests have shown that it's as secure or more secure than some commercial software.
So one other question from me is, in some sense, China created, as you mentioned them, I can't remember what you call them, but I mean, essentially, you know, another Google and another Facebook and another you know, Amazon. Do you think Europe could or should do that to sort of balance things out? So, you know, we created Airbus in order to balance out Boeing. Maybe there should be a kind of European set of platforms. Would there be something horribly wrong with that? Would it be difficult to do?
I think it is. I mean, there have been discussions of that, of doing kind of own platforms after some of the big security breaches that were taking place after the Snowden revelations. And for commercial reasons, it just, for whatever reason, it just hasn't worked. There's a lot of great research, a few companies, but if you look at the large companies, the large platforms, none are coming from Europe, and I think it's hard to innovate, to come up with these ideas, and it just, so far, it hasn't worked.
Right. So what I wanted to ask a little bit more is this idea of the Internet of Things and 5G and privacy. So, in some sense, what we've been talking about mostly, I mean, I know in the book you talk more about it, but mostly it's people voluntarily going and giving their data. But once we get into the Internet of Things, when there's sensors on everything and it's all connected through 5G, it'll be machines and things, be our front door, it'll be the bus sharing our information and data. Do you think, and a much, much, much more of it. So do you think that modifies what you've been talking about, where really we're kind of like, okay, I sign up to Google and they've tracked my usage, but I'm kind of doing that and it's very retail. But if they start tracking everything I own, is that a different problem?
Yeah, potentially, for sure. And that's why this, this whole trust paradox has to be solved, that people have to have confidence. And if we're not confident in a website, what it's doing with our data, where it's going, who it's being shared with, what's being done with it, as we're starting to walk in a smart city, potentially a lot more information is available to potentially a lot more companies and government and others. So again, that's why I think there's really a premium on solving this digital trust issue, so that people are comfortable that they're getting benefits, but not harms from IoT and all of these new services.
Okay, so let me see. I got another question here. I think we have time for about one more question. There's tons of them, Michael. So we're going to have to save the chat for you, and you can all go back, and tons of praise too. So
very nice. Thank you.
You can print them out and at the dinner table tonight, say, "Look, darling, that's what I do when my books come out." Okay, how worried are you that without greater multilateral governance, the internet can slowly become fragmented along national territories, allowing for mercantilist internet policies?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of discussed that, and it's certainly a possibility, although it would obviously have a huge cost, because the big benefit of the internet, of course, is the global network, the network effects, the ability to communicate, to access services, content anywhere right now. So there's some incentive for it, but again, usually you'd want to do it one way. You want a data localization policy, for instance, that keeps data in your country, so that you build up the data centers and you build up the data processing, but you serve the rest of the region. If everyone does it, then there's going to be a lot less investment, because no one wants to put a data center in every country.
Right. Very good. Okay, I'm going to give you one last question before we go, and that is one of the things that often comes up in these conversations is quantum computing, and that we may be on the edge. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of a really fundamental change in what is and what isn't possible in terms of security, in terms of processing, in terms of the more or less automated or software robots doing amazing things. If quantum computing was further along, would you have added another chapter on that in your book?
I think so, yeah. I mean, for sure, and it's going to lead to a bit of an arms race, because as quantum computing cracks encryption codes, for instance, then people are going to have to develop new, and it's going to be a bit of a tussle. And then, of course, as you know from your books, there's going to be a big impact on work, and the quality of work and the type of work, as these computers start to automate some of the processes. The part that I did talk about is, the artificial intelligence. We have to trust that it was trained on unbiased data, if that exists. so that it doesn't pick up the biases of the world and just translate them into ongoing decisions that are very hard to understand.
Very good. I will close, we're just at the top of the hour. We'll close with one more quote from the back of Michael's book. It says, Michael Kende's unique mastery of economics and technologies and governance structures that enable the internet's explosive growth makes this an essential and accessible read. I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Michael, for presenting your book, and thank for all the audience who's participated. And thank you to the technical staff of CTEI, Michael and Juanita, who've made this such a smooth and pleasurable presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you for all the comments. That's just wonderful and really gratifying to see. Thank you, Richard, Michael, and Juanita as well. And I'll be reading these chats probably for more than just one dinner.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
All right, thank you.